Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, we have a very special guest for you today that came in all the way from Topsfield, Massachusetts. And in this rainy weather, it was quite a trip. Anyways, this gentleman was very much involved in starting Massachusetts Citizens for Life. But today we're going to talk about another organization that he was there in the founding of, and it's the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund of Massachusetts. A little bit of his background: he's actually not an attorney, which is unusual because most of the people in that organization are attorneys. Well, welcome, Roy Scarpato.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, Brendan.
Roy, how is it that you got involved? What kind of a background do you have? It's not a legal background. With,
No, I'm an engineer, a graduate of MIT, and I happened to meet the guy that I think is the really founding father of the pro-life movement, Dr. Joseph Stanton, and he introduced me to the pro-life issue. And as an engineer, we're trained to think logically, and logic took me to the point of understanding that the protection of human life from its beginning to its end was a very important aspect of our civilized society. So I just had to get involved in that defense.
Interestingly enough, I went to school with one of Dr. Stanton's children,
Really?
John Stanton, at St. Sebastian's, which was just down the street from their house, and also his nephew, who was the twin brother of Dr. Stanton, Ned Stanton. His twin brother, I believe, was Edward. But I was kind of just getting involved with the pro-life movement when Dr. Stanton passed away. Well, now, then how did Dr. Stanton, or who, were you challenged about, well, gee, you're an engineer. This is a legal group. This is lawyers. Why would an engineer get involved with?
It was an interesting turn of events. I noticed an ad in the paper by the Value of Life Committee talking about the pro-life issue, and I decided to pay a visit to the offices of the Value of Life Committee in Boston. And while I was there, Dr. Stanton happened to come in, and I must say that he was rather suspicious of me in the beginning, nosing around in his headquarters, and he wanted to know why I was pro-life, and I tried to explain it to him, and he asked me to go home and write an essay on why I was pro-life. So I went ahead and did that, and I guess he was finally convinced of my bona fides. And so he accepted me into the pro-life group. At that time, it was the Value of Life Committee, but shortly thereafter, there was a referendum question that was occurring on the ballots of 20 selected cities and towns in Massachusetts, which basically said abortion should be simply a matter between a woman and her doctor. And it was an advisory referendum question, non-binding, but Dr. Stanton called the people that he knew in those 20 cities and towns, tried to get a group together who would oppose this referendum question. And so in 10 short weeks, we were able to mount a battle to fight against this referendum question, starting from ground zero.
So the pro-abortion forces went to 20 cities and towns. I presume they went to the liberal cities and towns.
Liberal cities and towns, including my town of Wayland. And about 2 weeks before the actual vote, the Globe published a poll in which they said that this question would pass by 75 to 80% majority. In the event, it was like 52% to 48%. Had we had about 2 more weeks, I think we could have actually turned that around. But the result of it was that a group had formed to fight that referendum question, and now we decided to make a permanent organization out of it, and that was the foundation of Mass Citizens for Life.
Oh, I see. So the Value of Life Committee then became
Well, no, the Value of Life Committee remained.
Did it?
The Value of Life Committee was made up of lawyers and doctors and academics and clergymen. and they published learned papers on the issue, but they were not a citizens action group such as Mass Citizens for Life. So Mass Citizens for Life was a 501c4 organization which allowed us to get involved in political activity.
I see. And then now this was back in what, 1973 or
72, actually.
72?
Right.
And then the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund, when did they come into being?
Well, about a year after the foundation of Mass Citizens for Life, we put forth to the legislature a group of revisions to Chapter 112 of the General Laws of Massachusetts as it related to abortion. For example, requiring parental consent for minor girls to have an abortion, and other things that basically were designed to push the limits of Roe versus Wade, to see how far we could tighten it up.
You mean push the limits, you mean to not encourage, but to discourage abortion.
Yes. In other words, after Roe versus Wade, there were basically no laws that stood up in the United States after that. They were all struck down.
All state laws were struck down.
All state laws were struck down. So there were, everything goes. You could have abortions right up to the 9th month. You could have minor girls having abortions without their parents' knowledge. You could have people who were not trained as OBGYN men, foot doctors, for example, being able to perform abortions because the Supreme Court said only doctors.
Right.
Well,
But it was Roe versus Wade and the same day decision, Doe versus Bolton, which
correct.
gave it all the way up to birth, Doe versus Bolton.
Yes, and so in the absence of any constraining law, it was up to the individual states to come forward and present laws so long as they didn't violate Roe versus Wade. So what we did was try to construct a series of laws that would basically push the limits of Roe versus Wade. One quick example, the Supreme Court said that the states could go so far as to ban abortions after viability, which they said could occur in the 28th week, but maybe even as early as the 24th. And as long as it didn't interfere with the mother's health. So we proposed amending the law so that viability would be defined as tight as the court would allow at 24 weeks. And it would require a serious threat to the woman's health to justify an abortion, not just a feeling of unease about it. So this was passed by the legislature overwhelmingly in Massachusetts. Mass Citizens for Life by that time had grown to 50 chapters across the state and a 100,000 person mailing list. The legislature took notice of this, and at the time of the vote of this on this bill, the legislature overwhelmingly passed it sufficiently to override the veto of Governor Sargent.
And at that time, in the early to mid 70s, was the legislature dominated by the Democrats, and were the Democrats as pro-abortion as they are today?
The legislature was dominated by the Democrats, although not to the extent it is today, but still there was a sizable majority of Democrats, but they were not as pro-abortion as they appear to be today. And they were very aware of the growth of Mass Citizens for Life, to the point, as I indicated, that they were able to override the governor's veto at that time. So it became a law, and we thought that everything was great, the law was in effect. On the day that that law was to take effect, Bill Beard, who was a local Boston abortion entrepreneur, if I may describe him that way, went into federal court in Boston and sought an injunction against the effectiveness of this law to prevent it from taking effect on the grounds that it interfered with the privacy of minor women, including 13-year-old minor women who might want to have an abortion without having to inform their parents.
And would he have needed standing at that point to try to I mean, I know a lot of cases, if you don't have quote-unquote standing, then you don't really have a case. Did Baird have a standing, or did he have a...
Well, his standing was based on the fact that he made his livelihood out of teenage girls coming to him for abortions without parental consent. They'd be afraid to tell their parents, they'd be worried, and the easy way out would be for them to contact an older person who would take them to the abortion clinic, and no knowledge of their parents unless, of course, a medical emergency might arise. Then the parents would be notified from the hospital that their daughter was there. But Bill Baird wanted to preserve his income.
But a lot of these teenagers were having the abortions in abortion clinics, not in hospitals, I presume.
Mostly in abortion clinics.
So if they had been injured during the abortion, then they would transport them to a hospital, and then the parents would find out?
And then the parents would find out, and then the parents would have the bill to pay. But up until that time, they could be taken out of their school, brought to a Planned Parenthood, for example, institution, and abortion performed on them without their parents' knowledge or consent. So one of the things our law did was to say, no, you can't do that. You have to have the consent of your parents if you're under 18. And another thing that was required by our law was that the facilities under which the abortion could be performed had to pass a state inspection and have some minimum level of not only cleanliness and sanitation, but of equipment that would be necessary in case of an emergency. These were all part of the law that we proposed and all part of the law that was suspended when the federal court in Boston granted that injunction.
And is that injunction still in place, or what happened after that?
Well, what happened, the first thing that happened was that we in Mass Citizens for Life realized that the battle was not over just because we had won in the legislature. We needed an ongoing legal entity which would be prepared to fight the battle in the courts. And so that was the genesis of the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund, the gathering together of lawyers who would volunteer their time on a pro bono basis, become educated into the law relating to abortion, and be prepared to fight the battle in the courts. So we challenged that decision of the local federal court, and it became a case called Baird versus Bellotti, because Bellotti was the Attorney General who was charged with defending the law that Massachusetts had passed. And that bounced between one federal court and the state Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, and finally went to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court said, well, you can't have a law that interferes with the privacy of a young woman. But if the law provided for a judicial bypass to go before a state judge, and if the judge ruled that it was in the best interest of the girl, she could have the abortion. Then if the law contained that provision, the court would favor it. And so we went back to the legislature, we changed the law, we put that provision in, and the Supreme Court then said, okay. So the injunction, the original injunction, was dismissed at that point.
And what about, I got two questions. One is, well, what about the facilities, the abortion facilities being up to medical standards of, say, a hospital or some other type of medical facility? Did that get struck down?
No, that's still part of the law in Massachusetts. The problem is not the law, but the enforcement of the law. Now, I mean, we have in the law that was passed in 1972 all of the provisions that would tend to be protective of women who were seeking an abortion, to make sure that they had given their full consent, make sure that the facility had the proper precautions and the proper medical equipment, and make sure that the consent of the parents or the judge was actually obtained. But if the state of Massachusetts chooses not to enforce the law, then we in the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund have contacted the Attorney General on a number of occasions and complained about the lax enforcement of the law. And the response that we've gotten is, this is a matter of prosecutorial discretion. We can determine where we want to put our assets, and we're not going to put them in that direction. So unless there's a political change, there's not going to be much effectiveness in the law that we passed at that time.
I see. And the other aspect of this is, well, you've got this change regarding the young girl can go into a courtroom, and it's my understanding that they can go into a courtroom with a judge, and the judge clears out the courtroom a lot of times, and that there's really no one there defending the child in the womb. Is that still the case?
That, unfortunately, is the case. The attorney, generally from Planned Parenthood, will come with the minor girl to the judge's court. It'll be in a closed environment. Parents are not involved in it, not even notified about it. I had a friend who was the superintendent of schools in my hometown, and he was heartbroken because he told me that when the attorney from Planned Parenthood comes to take a girl out of school to have an abortion, he is required by law not to tell the parents. And if the parents call up and say, you know, is my girl at school today, he has to lie and say, yes, she is, because he's forbidden by law to tell the parents that the girl has been taken to court. And this was a person who was a good moral superintendent of schools, and he was heartbroken that he had to do this under the laws of Massachusetts.
Wow, that's really something. Well, so the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund got together, and they've been in dealing with these types of issues. What are some of the other issues that they're involved with?
Well, for a good period of time, we were actively involved in protection of the First Amendment rights of protesters, like Operation Rescue, for example. In many cases, we had overzealous police enforcement so that they felt that anybody who was protesting at all was breaking the law, and they would arrest them. I mean, Operation Rescue people did tend to blockade places, and so they were arrested for doing that. But in many cases, they were treated very badly when they got to the police station. Dr. Stanton, for example, had suffered from polio as a child, and so he was crippled and walked with a cane. He was arrested at the time of a rescue, an Operation Rescue, and taken to the prison, the jail, and thrown on the floor and broke a couple of his ribs.
Oh, wow.
Well, we stepped in. Our lawyers all operate pro bono. They don't charge anything. And they would go into court and make sure that the civil rights of our people were protected, and make sure that if people were simply carrying a sign outside of an abortion clinic, that they were not told to disperse, that they had a First Amendment right to be there. So there was a series of